Hello everyone, I'm Manabendra Sir and I'll be taking up your biology part. So for today, in this lecture, we will be talking about chapter 3, that is your plant kingdom. But before we move into this chapter, I would like to discuss some basics before starting the chapter. So our lecture for today is going to be on plant kingdom, where we are going to talk about the classification system. As you all are aware that in our previous lectures, we have already talked about what exactly is taxonomy, what exactly is the importance of classification, and I would also like to recall what we have already discussed in the second chapter, that is your biological classification. So as you all are already aware that we have studied about the 5 kingdom classification system in our previous lecture. Today we will be talking about one of the kingdoms about which we have already discussed in the 5 kingdom classification system. Now I think you all are pretty well aware that we have talked about what exactly is the 5 kingdom classification system and who actually proposed the 5 kingdom classification system. I think you all are aware that this 5 kingdom classification system was proposed by Irish Whittaker in the year 1969. And let us just try to recall what exactly were the different kingdoms. So maybe you all will be able to recall that we have talked about Monera, we have talked about Protista, we have talked about fungi, we have talked about Plantae, and last but not the least, we have talked about Animalia. Now, what we are basically going to talk about today is your kingdom Plantae. So, before we start, I would like to put some light on what exactly has changed over the course of time. So, as you all know that as time has passed, ultimately there has been different changes. We have talked about different classification systems while we were studying about the very introductory part of your second chapter. But today what we are basically going to talk about is the kingdom Plantae, where we are going to talk about the different classification system. Now, before we start, let us try to recall what we already know in chapter 2. You know about the type of cell. We have talked about what exactly is eukaryotic. We have talked about what exactly is prokaryotic. As you all know that prokaryotic basically refers to very primitive, whereas eukaryotic refers to well developed. That is, they have a well defined nuclear membrane as well as they have well developed cell organelles, which is not the case in prokaryotes. Now, when we talk about Plantae, ultimately in this part, the classification system, we are going to mainly focus with reference to your angiosperms. Now, let us try to put some light on what are the different classification systems that we are going to talk over here. So, in the very beginning, we are going to talk about the artificial classification system. Next, we talk about the natural classification system. And last but not the least, we talk about phylogenetic classification system. Now, first and foremost thing which you are supposed to know when we talk about the artificial classification system. So the first and foremost thing which we shall know when we are talking about this 3 classification system is who actually proposed the artificial classification system, who actually proposed the natural classification system, and who is actually responsible for proposing the phylogenetic classification system. But much before we move into the depth, I would like to emphasize on the fact that this classification system is the most acceptable classification system. In the later part of this lecture, we will try to know why exactly the phylogenetic classification system is more acceptable or is the most acceptable classification system in comparison to the artificial classification system and the natural classification system. So first and foremost, you are supposed to know that this artificial classification system was basically proposed by Linnaeus. Now, who exactly is Linnaeus? Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy. As you have already studied about taxonomy in your very first chapter, I would like to again recall what we have already discussed in the first lecture, where we have discussed about the very first chapter of your class 11. So, Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy. He basically proposed the artificial classification system. Now, what exactly does this classification system say? So ultimately this was the very first classification system which was proposed by Linnaeus, and this classification system was completely based on gross morphological characters. Now, will it be convenient enough to say that just considering the gross morphological characters shall be enough? Obviously it's not. Apart from that, it gave equal weightage to your vegetative and sexual characters, which again was a very unacceptable point of this classification system. With time, there was a need of another classification system, which was basically the natural classification system. This was the second classification system which is proposed by Bentham and Hooker, and this was somewhat much better than what we have already talked about in artificial classification system. Now when we say gross morphological characters or gross superficial characters, what does it mean? We'll be talking about the habit, we will be talking about the color, we will be talking about the shape of leaves. That is what was basically considered in the artificial classification system. Now when we talk about the natural classification system, one thing that was much better about this classification system was obviously that it included some more aspects in comparison to what was basically included in the artificial classification system. So we would like to put some light on what exactly was included in the natural classification system, what exactly was being considered in the natural classification system. So the first thing that was basically considered in the natural classification system was basically the ultrastructure. So this is a word which you need to remember with reference to your natural classification system. Next, it gave due importance to the anatomical features. Now, what exactly are the anatomical features? Ultimately, it refers to the internal structure. There was a reference of embryology. And apart from that, it also considered the aspect of phytochemistry. Now, what exactly is the ultrastructure? Ultrastructure is basically the structure which can be easily visualized under the microscope. In very simple terms, we can say that this structure is the structure which can be actually visualized with the help of high resolution microscopes. Now, what is anatomy? Anatomy is basically the internal features. Embryology, how the embryo basically develops, and phytochemistry is basically the chemicals that we derive from plants. Obviously, this classification system, that was the natural classification system, was much better in comparison to what was actually proposed by the father of taxonomy, Linnaeus, because it took into account some additional features which proved out to be very significant. But yet again, this was not the most acceptable classification system. Now, which exactly is the most classification system? As I have already told in my previous part, that phylogenetic classification system is the most acceptable system because it takes into account the evolutionary relationships. Means it is going to ensure that same type of organisms are basically placed under the same category because they are going to consider. Next, we talk about the phylogenetic classification system, which is the most acceptable classification system, as I have already told in the beginning of the lecture. Now, why exactly is it the most acceptable classification system? Because as I have already written, it is going to consider the evolutionary relationship, means it is going to properly analyze that which organism is related to which organism, which makes it the most convenient and the most acceptable classification system in the recent time. Now, who actually proposed the phylogenetic classification system? So the phylogenetic classification system was basically proposed by Eicher, Engler, and Brethren. Now, as we have talked about all the three classification systems, let us just try to summarize what exactly are the advantage and what exactly are the disadvantage. Now, the very first one we talked about was artificial classification system. As I have already told, this was proposed by Linnaeus and it is considered gross superficial morphological characters. It gave equal weightage to vegetative and sexual characters, which was the most unacceptable point about the classification system. Next, we have talked about the natural classification system, where due importance was given to external characteristics, but apart from that, consideration. Apart from considering the external features, it also considered the ultrastructure, the anatomical features, embryology, and the phytochemistry. As I have already told what the different terminologies mean, last but not the least, we have talked about the phylogenetic classification system, which is the most acceptable classification system because it did not separate closely related organisms. Now, what is going to be the scenario if there is no evidence? What is going to be the scenario if there is no fossil? We are supposed to talk about numerical taxonomy. will talk about cytotaxonomy, and we are going to talk about chemotaxonomy. Now, what exactly is your numerical taxonomy? Numerical taxonomy basically refers to the use of numbers or codes against characters which are analyzed with the help of computers, which means that number of characters can be considered in due course of time, and number of characters can also be analyzed with the help of computers, which is going to give us how two different organisms are related or how two different organisms are not related. Next we talk about cytotaxonomy, where we basically talk about the chromosome. Now what exactly do we talk about the chromosome? We are going to talk about the number of chromosome, we are going to talk about the number of chromosome, we are going to talk about the structure of chromosome, as well as we are going to talk about the function of chromosome. Now last but not the least, we should know what exactly is chemotaxonomy. Chemotaxonomy basically refers to considering the chemical constituent. Now when we basically consider the chemical constituent, ultimately we say that it is basically chemotaxonomy. Now the big question that arises, when are we going to use this? We are going to use this when there are no fossil evidence. So with this, I come to the end of this lecture, which basically was on the very introductory part of a very important chapter, Plant Kingdom. Now let me tell you something with reference to the weightage. The weightage of this chapter for NEET UG. So basically the weightage is basically 2 to 3 questions. Ultimately you can expect 2 or 3 questions from basically this chapter, and your preparation should be very good in order to answer questions from the chapter, because most of the questions which have been asked in the previous years are direct questions from the NCERT, so you need to be very thorough with the NCERT. Apart from that, we also need to focus on some additional information which I'll be giving while we will be discussing about the different topics of this chapter. So for today that was all, and this was basically the information regarding the classification system that you are supposed to know in order to understand the chapter in a much better way. So with this we come to the end of today's lecture, where we have basically discussed about the classification system, we have talked about artificial, natural and phylogenetic classification system, we have talked what exactly is basically used when there is no fossil evidence, that is we have talked about numerical taxonomy, we have talked about cytotaxonomy, we have talked about chemotaxonomy. So in our next lectures we will be dealing with the different topics with reference to this chapter. Till then, this was all for today. Thank you so much for attending the class.